Hello again. Good to have your company. Welcome to another edition of the Small Caps podcast. I'm Peter Capsanis. Well, if you're considering investing your money in medicinal cannabis, oil and gas, or revolutionary technology aimed at better understanding brain anesthesia, then sit back and listen carefully. BPH Energy is an ASX listed company based in Perth developing biomedical research and technologies within Australian universities and hospital institutes. The company provides early stage funding, project management, and commercialization strategies for a direct collaboration, a spin out company, or to secure a license. BPH has a stake in Advent Energy, which has a major stake in the Sydney offshore oil and gas field. It also has a stake in Cortical Dynamics, which, through the University of Swinburne, is developing technology aimed at detecting the effect anesthetic agents have on brain activity, which, in layman's terms, means making sure you don't wake up in the middle of surgery. And then there's Patagonia Cannabis, which has a medicinal cannabis operation in Chile. So, a lot to take in, but to tell us more, we're joined by the Managing Director of BPH, David Breeze. David, good to have your company.
Thank you indeed. Pleased to be able to talk to you about BPH.
David, let's start with the exciting news from this week. And your share price has rallied, so much so where your market cap sits just under $9 million following a 41% rise in your share price. What's been the catalyst?
So what has occurred is we have applied just prior to the end of the year for a suspension and extension to NOPTA, who is the National Offshore Petroleum Authority. And for several months, we've been going through the process of review and clarification of that application. The application was to enable us to have the necessary time to be able to go and drill the offshore PEP 11 permit, which is offshore New South Wales and runs between Newcastle and down towards Sydney and out towards the continental shelf for about 50 kilometres. And NOPTA has put on their website that we're now in the final stage of that approval process. And at the same time, as BPH was suspended, Bounty Oil and Gas, who's our joint venture partner through Advent Energy in the PEP 11 permit, actually went up quite considerably. In fact, Bounty went up 400%. BPH had been suspended because it had been going through an approval or assessment process with the ASX. And now, of course, the market can trade in our shares, and they're seeing, in fact, that the NOPTA approval process is nearing completion.
So the NOPTA approval process has had a massive positive influence and domino effect on BPH and the other joint venture partners there. You've had the PEP 11 project on the books for around 14 years. You were telling me earlier. What's going to be happening there down the track? When do you start drilling or begin production? Is there a timeline, a hopeful timeline on the horizon? Or are you willing to obviously the price has been rallying quite well, but I mean, what's the end goal as far as PEP 11 is concerned from BPH's perspective?
So the important thing to consider here is the context of PEP 11 and the permit in the East Coast gas supply crisis or a shortage. Gas prices and the gas supply are intertwined, of course, in the entire East Coast gas market. And what we have seen over the last several years is an identification through repeated government reports that there is likely to be a shortfall in the supply of gas in approximately a year to 2 years out from now. And we've seen that reflected in the price increases in gas, and those prices of gas into that market have been impacted by the LNG projects to the north up in Queensland and the shortage of gas that's arisen as a result of that. And it's also been impacted by the potential downturn in the supply of gas out of the Victorian offshore fields in the Bass Strait. What that's meant is that the price of gas in the Sydney area has gone as high as at least $11, and even at the moment is still sitting at about a range of around $8 a gigajoule. And those two elements, that is being the demand for gas and the price, really means that our project, which is immediately offshore New South Wales, become and is the only permit on the entire east coast margin of Australia, can be a potential input or solution to that gas supply issue. So, in fact, when you look at the relative positioning of the gas supply markets, and we look at the Bass Strait gas fields, in fact, they were discovered around 50 years ago, and they were put into development. They had a 10 TCF prospective recoverable resource and they have in fact utilised around 6 TCF of the gas that was discovered in the offshore fields in Victoria over the last 50-year period. Prospectively, the PEP 11 permit has around 6 TCF of gas, and so a 6 TCF resource would be a really significant game changer were the drilling to initiate the proving up of that resource. And that is the aspect that has really interested people.
So the prospect of BPH being or playing a major role as gas producer and supplier in the near future, that obviously is quite tantalising and exciting.
Yes, again in context, BPH Energy owns 22% of Advent Energy. Advent Energy is an unlisted public company, and in fact has been structured so that it can in the future, with the right prerequisites, list on a stock exchange. And the Advent Energy has an 85% interest in the PEP 11 permit, and Bounty has a 15% interest in the PEP 11 permit. To give you the base level metrics on that, you've got BPH with a 22% interest of an 85% holder in the permit with a prospective 5 to 6 TCF prospective or recoverable gas resource. And it's that aspect that's important. There's a second aspect that I should speak to here. Around 1/3 of Australia's CO2 emissions comes from the coal-fired power plants and other industrial centres in a big arc around Sydney, Newcastle. And prospectively, the offshore permit has in repeated government publications been a potential source for geosequestration or removal of CO2. So in fact, the PEP 11 permit can be looked at as both a contribution to the environment in terms of a removal of CO2 from those coal-fired power stations, and also, most importantly, and that's been recognised by the government again most recently in whilst wind and solar have now become real contributors into the energy supply mix in Australia, there is a need for baseload power, and gas as a baseload power source is a significant necessary input as we make that transition into an electricity network that is supplied by the solar and wind sources, but you have to have a baseload power, and that becomes very important because a supply of gas from our project, which and the initial well is approximately 25 kilometres offshore, would become very important for power generation and, in fact, to the potential reduction of electricity prices and energy prices in the East Coast gas market. It's those combined elements that really bring the potential for PEP 11 and the interest in the permit.
Is there a timeline as to when you would expect to receive final approval from NOPTA in relation to PEP 11, David?
The NOPTA process in that final stage normally takes several months, and the NOPTA website indicates that we're coming towards the end of that timeline.
And I mentioned that your share price jumped a whopping 41%, 41% this week. Where does your share price sit now, and where did it start from prior to that 41% jump?
We had a low of 0.006, and at the moment it's at 2.2 cents. So, in fact, we on the first day of trading after the lifting of the suspension, we had 100% price rise, and even yesterday we had a 41% price rise. So, in fact, what's occurred is that Bounty had a 400% price rise over the last 12 months, and we've now been playing catch up. I spoke about the metrics. We've got, just to remind you, we've got a 22% interest in Advent, and Advent itself has an 85% interest. So the mathematics of the relative holding of BPH through its interest there really shows that we've got, even now, if you took it on a comparative basis, a bit of catching up to do with Bounty's valuation, because Bounty is now north of $10 million on the market at the moment.
Well, certainly some exciting times ahead. We'll be keeping a close eye on PEP 11 and what NOPTA says in the months to follow, David. If I can move to another part of your business, and that's in relation to Cortical Dynamics. As I mentioned, that's looking at how anaesthesia impacts on brain activity, and you've been doing some work in this space for a while now. Tell me a bit about Cortical Dynamics and balm, which is being used at the moment.
When you're going into anaesthesia, you want to have what's called balanced anaesthesia. That is, you need to have sufficient anaesthetic and sufficient analgesia so that you are asleep during the course of the operation, and also you're not feeling any pain even though that you are asleep, because pain, of course, from the operation has an impact on pulse and heart rate, and you have these physical responses if there's not sufficient analgesia. The balm device, which was developed at Swinburne University, has the capacity to measure both the depth of anesthesia and the depth of analgesia. And that aspect of balanced anesthesia is very important, of course, and is of real interest, particularly as more and more operations around the world are carried out with what's called TIVA, or intravenous anesthesia. That's, in short, it's the introduction of the anesthesia and the analgesia through a drip in the arm, as opposed to an inhaled anesthetic through your mouth or nose during the operation. And Tiva is now used in up to 70% of operations in Europe, and it's that aspect and the automation and or the adjunct of anaesthesia monitoring capacity being offered to the anaesthetist in the course of the operation that really becomes a key aspect of the future value and development of Cortical. And of course, we've just announced that Cortical has entered into an agreement with Philips, the international company, to integrate the Cortical balm device in with Philips into their IntelliBridge unit. I'll put that in context. Philips have a significant market in terms of the usage of their central monitoring control system in operating theatres globally. In other words, the Philips screens and monitoring shows your heart rate, your pulse, and other key physical characteristics during the operation. And the IntelliBridge system developed by Philips is a terrific adjunct into the operating theatre and offering the capacity for companies like BARM to integrate their technology to be able to be displayed on the Philips screen in the operating theatre. And that's a really important development for the potential market penetration of the BARM device on a global basis.
What does BARM mean? BARM, I believe. David, what does it stand for?
Brain Anesthesia Response Monitor. In other words, it's telling you just how deeply anaesthetized it is. It's quite simple in the net result. What you see on the screen whilst the BARM is in operation is a number. And if the number is at 30, then you're asleep. And if the number is at 80, you're awake. And so it becomes an adjunct to the anaesthetist so that he can, in fact, look at that number, and as opposed to physical signs, which would otherwise give him a guide to how deeply anaesthetized you are, you have a number which will assist him in the monitoring of the depth of anesthesia of the patient.
Yes, well, the last thing you'd want is to wake up during surgery and no one to realise that would be quite alarming and concerning, not to say the least. What's the purpose and why has BPH bought into this company? Obviously, the leverage opportunities are quite enormous. What sparked the relationship between BPH and Cortical to begin with?
So BPH initiated its listing on the stock exchange as an investor and funder of medtech and biotech and technology developed at Australian universities and research institutions. And what we did was to look around at the time that we initiated the listing of BPH on the stock exchange. We looked at research that was being conducted in universities and institutes across Australia, and we looked for technologies or developments that had certain key attributes. And the key attributes were that it addressed a global market, that it had the potential for $1 billion, and that those markets were $1 billion plus markets. And the depth of anesthesia market, we identified that Cortical had in fact the attributes that could in fact be a game shifter or a disruptor into the existing products in that marketplace. And so for that reason, we invested in Cortical, and have assisted its funding over the period, so that we've brought it forward to where it is, where it now has both TGA and CE certification. And of course, we have been going through a process of application into the Korean anaesthesia market, such that we are close to completion of the Korean certification process to be able to sell and distribute the product into Korea soon. And of course, what we've also now done is to initiate an approval process with the FDA. And the FDA, as people who monitor this space, is the regulatory authority that certifies product for distribution into the United States. And the FDA process can be complex, time-consuming, and costly. And it's why we went for TGA and CE certification in the first instance. But we're now ready because we now have a new investor called Intuitive X, who is an incubator and a funder, and a group that's based in Seattle in the US, that in fact is recognized as one of the top 5 entities in this space in the United States to assist companies like ourselves going through that process. And that's what we've now initiated.
David, the other part of the business is medicinal cannabis, Patagonia Cannabis, a project out of Chile. What's the latest there?
So the interest in the cannabis is the medicinal cannabis, and of course, medicinal cannabis has been going through a significant growth phase on a global basis. That is because there is a recognized use for cannabis for certain components of the cannabis plant in the amelioration or treatment of a range of ailments. And the medicinal cannabis has been approved for use in Australia, Canada, UK, and is now a significant and growing market. And we invested in Patagonia because of its the range and the unique range of the seed bank that it had, in the simplest terms, sourced out of Chile. That's been recognized most recently by the fact that one of the leading research institutes in Israel has now entered into a joint venture, a joint research program with Patagonia to assess the medicinal components of the cannabis resource that Patagonia brings to the process.
And this product being rolled out, where are you in terms of production and distribution? How wide is the distribution network, I guess is what I'm saying?
So the other announcement that was made, and so there's 2 aspects to this. Patagonia announced that, and we then announced that it was going through an approval process for the elements of production in Chile, and we're still, that process is still ongoing. But also what Patagonia did was to announce that they in turn have entered into a production and licensing agreement with a group based out of Gibraltar and Spain, such that production could begin in Spain of a certain brand or a product type of cannabis that had a very high medicinal component to its genetic makeup. And that's the the latest step in the Patagonia's process.
David, before we wrap things up, is there anything else you'd like to talk about in terms of BPH Energy and its diversity or diverse range of portfolios?
We have announced that we're looking at other areas of medtech space, and we've put that into recent announcements, and we will make further announcements when it's appropriate to do so in that space. But the gas will be a major development. That is because there is strong government support for alternate sources of gas supply into the East Coast gas market, and that will be a key component for us. And obviously, we can look to a drilling and the suspension and extension will be to enable that process, and that'll be a key in the next steps in terms of what will occur with BPH. Otherwise, I thank you for your time today and for the opportunity to speak to you about our developments.
David, it's been really exciting and really interesting speaking to you today, and thank you for elaborating and expanding on all the diversity that BPH certainly has to offer. I'm sure plenty of people listening today will be plotting in those letters right now as we speak to look up BPH and what it offers. So thank you for your time today, and Small Caps looks forward to being there every step of the way as the BPH story unfolds in the weeks and months ahead. So thanks again for joining us on the Small Caps podcast today.
Thank you, Peter.